deducing the information about what your opponent might be able to do by narrowing the possibility space based on these little bits of information that leak out from your opponent as they're playing the game.
Distraction makers.
It's time to talk about the exciting world of information management.
That's right. Basically, we're just going to be talking about the different types of information that you end up seeing in games and the range of them and the different effects that they have depending on what range of information that you, as the designer, deliver to your players. Before we start talking about information management, please, if you like our videos, give us a little like and subscribe or a comment down below. Also, if you're interested in game design, you can join our Discord. You can find a link down in the description below. And before we keep going, today's video is brought to you by
My Game. It's coming to Kickstarter soon. It's Bullets and Teeth and Aliens. It's a cooperative card game for 2 to 5 players where you're blasting space bugs. If that sounds cool to you, you can find the link in the description below.
And back to the video.
The sort of 3 distinct types of information that end up emerging in games in general are known information, unknown information, and partial information.
There's no games, we'll get into it, but there's no games that's usually like any one of these things. And they have different levels and range of information available to the player.
Right. So known just means that you can see all of the information almost in its entirety. There's almost always some part of unknown information in terms of like your opponent is a piece of unknown information because you don't know what they're going to do. But chess is an example of a game that is almost all known information except for your opponent. Unknown information is cards in hand that are obscured, cards in a deck. You don't know what the roll of a dice is going to be, things like that. Partial information, the best example in Magic is just that there's untapped mana and your opponent has cards in hand, so you can go, oh, they might be able to play something.
It's that you don't know the exact answer or you know some of the answer. Basically, partial information, it has to be like things that is generally unknown but is scoped in possibility space, right? You have a certain understanding of what the possibilities of something is going to be. If you have no understanding of what the possibility is of any one, card in a person's hand or whatever, then it's just completely unknown.
Right. And in this partial information zone is where I don't know if I would say the majority of interesting game interactions occur, but I think that like managing this particular space as a game designer is how you get particularly interesting gameplay. Where if you're operating with total known information, it's almost solved, right? And if you're operating with total unknown information, it's just a guess. So let's get into known information a little deeper.
Right. So, to tie this back to Magic, I think the closest example of how this could be used in Magic is card telepathy. It's a 1 blue enchantment that all opponents play with their hands revealed. We played a Commander game like this, and it was terrible.
Yep.
And it goes to show what ends up happening with known information. So, which is basically that like it ended up becoming a puzzle instantaneously, right? Which is usually what happens with more known information. Normally you might have like maybe the cards that you draw, that's technically not known, and that's going to alter some of your plans, but it's a puzzle that just keeps changing, right? The goal is defeat other players, but the puzzle and the puzzle pieces, you see all the possibilities available to you.
Puzzles tend to have a lot of known information, but they sort of have to have at least one piece of unknown information to still remain a puzzle. You either can't know what the solution is, or you can't know the process to get to that solution. Otherwise, it's just kind of a nothing. Right?
It's just memorization and an exercise at that point.
Right, it's like a thing you've already done and solved.
Yeah.
And so something like a jigsaw puzzle, right? Like you'll know the inevitable answer, which is the picture on the box, but the pieces are randomized in a way so that you don't know what order you're going to be able to find them in to create that picture.
And the reverse would be like an escape room, where the escape room, you might not know what the final answer is. You have an objective, escape the room, but you don't know exactly how to find that answer. You also don't know the sequencing of it, but like it's still a mystery of where you're going to end up going, I suppose.
So a lot of puzzles tend to exist in this kind of known information land. The one I always think of is like the like metal puzzles that you move in a particular way and they come apart. And you're like, oh, I did it. It's like all of the information's there. You just need to figure out how to manipulate it to get to the answer. Let's talk about unknown information a little bit. And then we'll get to partial information, which is really the meat of the topic. So unknown information, I think the easiest sort of game example is something like rock, paper, scissors, where you are just sort of guessing what your opponent might do. I think there's kind of like ways that people think they can deduce information to try to like get something out of their opponent, some tells or things, which might exist. But I think generally speaking, you're just choosing one of 3 options, and those options have consequences, but there's no real backing to why you would pick one or the other.
I think it's funny too, because like I think the only way that a game, like that could exist is because there are only 3 options.
Yeah.
But if we were to relate it to Magic the Gathering, right, and you just have a deck and you don't see what color, what lands are tapped or untapped, and how many cards are in hand, you see no information whatsoever, and players can just play whatever cards they want at any point in time. It's like the scope of that is so large and so complicated that like there's no way that you could ever chunk that information. So it really would just be like guessing all the time.
Yeah, well, and the one toy game that Richard Garfield uses is like guess the digit of pi, where it'll say something like guess the 551st digit of pi, and it's like technically known information, but it's so complicated that no person is really going to like take the time to figure it out, or especially if it's like in the moment you're supposed to guess it, right? Guess it right now. You're not going to like, okay, let me think about it. Technically it's known, but becomes sort of unknown because it's so complicated.
There are games that exist in this space. There's like a certain level of complexity that is all known information to you technically, but it's just such a huge puzzle to solve. And the possibility space is so wide that it's practically unknown. Might as well be unknown and just guessing.
Well, and I think a lot of beginner players experience this in Go, right? Where like, I don't know, like, oh, okay, I just need to like place a stone on the board, but I don't understand what that means, right? There's just so many options after I've placed one stone any given place that I don't really understand the ramifications of that action. Therefore, it's almost just random. Like, I'm just going to put the stone somewhere random, even though an experienced player would know the implications of any potential space on the board, theoretically. So let's talk about partial information, because really this is where the magic happens.
So Magic has all sorts of different ways of basically helping the player chunk down the complexity of the possibility space for partial information. Cards in hand, color of mana, untapped and tapped lands. You brought up that instant speed is also
speed.
one.
So yeah, and a lot of this is like sort of narrowing the possibility space of what your opponent might be able to do. So you're able to sort of make better educated guesses. So instant speeds, right, being on, okay, well on my turn, my opponent can only play instant speed things. So I know that whatever they're going to play has to be at least an instant, right? And then you narrow it you can narrow it down further with things like format that you're playing in, the colors that they're playing, how many cards they have in their hand, that kind of stuff.
And it gets to the point that like eventually when you end up having like a meta within your format, right, and you see the colors and the color possibilities of them, to where you can make like a fairly educated assumption of what they might have or could possibly end up drawing later in the game.
But it never quite gets certain, right? There's never a like, oh, well, I just know what they have. And I can just act accordingly because I know I have perfect information. There are certain instances where you can get pretty close, which is something like a discard spell, like a Thought Seize, where you get to see the information in their hand, and then you're writing it down. We'll come back to this. But yeah, in general, that's sort of like the way that you're operating within the game is deducing the information about what your opponent might be able to do by narrowing the possibility space based on these little bits of information that leak out from your opponent as they're playing the game.
Why do we think that partial information is so important to games? We see it mostly in turn-based games. There's like other more physical-based games that don't really have this, right? It's kind of viewed as like a pure skill. But to me, I feel like it's almost necessary when you have a certain level of variance or randomness in your game, right? Because if you have too much randomness or variance, you need some way to be able to help hone players in and limit the scope so that they're not just blindsided by what's coming.
So if we're talking about real-time games, right, you don't necessarily need this sort of partial information because the possibility space ends up getting narrowed based on time, right? So if you're in a situation, you only have so much time to figure out what to do, and then you have to do something. Something like a first-person shooter, like, oh, I can see everything that I can see. I know they're there. What am I going to do about it, right? So the sort of decision point almost gets moved. But we're talking about in a tabletop environment where you are things are turn-based, and you might have like a turn timer in a very competitive situation, but
Sure.
but in a casual, whatever situation. You're not going to have that. So you need some way to make it so that you can't just do the math and figure out exactly what you should be doing. Basically make a solvable game. So the way that you retain some of that unknown, right? You don't have the time limit to force decisions to be made quickly. So you must make it so that a complete decision cannot be made. So we end up with, okay, we're going to have some form of partial unknown information so that players have to develop heuristics in order to understand how to act accordingly in any given situation. So the skill that's being tested in that instance is how good am I at making decisions with partial information, right? Instead of memorizing what I'm supposed to do in one given situation.
And I think it can be tough to design for something like this, to account for this, right? Because it's tough when like everything is just, it ends up being this sort of exercise of probability, which is how you fall back on heuristics in a way. But like if it ends up being that the game skews in any sort of a probabilistic like choice, right? Where you end up deciding like, well, actually, 70% of the time, 80% of the time, this is what my opponent's going to have in this situation. So this is the card I should play every single time, right? And that can sort of become the solved thing. But I guess if there's enough randomness or variance like we're talking about in combination with this sort of unknown or partial information, then it makes it so that you can't just fall back on that like 70-80% chance.
Okay, so let's talk about the big no-no of information management.
There's a secret fourth kind.
There's a secret, horrible fourth kind.
We're talking about memorized information.
Yeah. So memorized information basically means that information becomes known and then becomes unknown again. And this would be something like, I reveal a card from my hand and then I put it back in my hand. Or I play a card face down as mana that I have to reveal first, Lorcana.
It's funny. We talked about it, I think, in our Lorcana video that that's why they didn't give can't write stuff down.
Yeah, literally, it makes it so they made it so you cannot write things down in a tournament,
which is actually forcing the skill of memorization even more.
Terrible.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But
terrible.
this is why in like Magic tournaments, a lot of players they'll have notepads with pencils.
You'll jot down information that had become known that then becomes unknown.
Right, and it's because the reason why is because memorized information. Like I guess it's kind of weird because it's like you can view it as like a mental skill, but it's kind of a physical skill. It's something that you could naturally be really good at. Some people are going to be worse at. It's probably something you can improve at, but generally it's a skill that is built outside of the game system. So if the game is specifically trying to test the skill of memorization, like a memory game or something, or some sort of a card counting game or whatever, then that's worthwhile. That's the game system built for that. But if the game's not built for that, right, then offering players some sort of an opportunity for them to just alleviate that burden, I think is probably best. And that's what Magic does, is they're telling players, like, at least at a high level, like, it's cool. You don't have to try and memorize all of these different cards that you've now seen. Like, you can just write it down and check back to it.
Information management is part of every game, right? Whether it's a almost entirely known information game or not, understanding the level of information management that your game wants is important. The more known information that's in the game, the more competitive it will probably be.
Right.
The more solvable it will probably be. So moving in the opposite direction, if you have almost no known information, like rock, paper, scissors, players are effectively just taking a guess.
Yeah, expect more variance to be at the whim of randomness because the possibility space is wider, so you don't have as much of an opportunity to make as much of an educated guess. Right. And I think like there's not one right answer necessarily.
No,
here,
it depends
right?
on the audience that you're trying to attract for your game. In general, information that becomes known and then unknown is bad. And usually where the magic happens is somewhere with the partial information of understanding, like building some kind of system to give players a way to make an educated guess about what their opponent might be doing.